A single drop of condensation slid down the curve of a crystal glass. It pooled on the polished obsidian surface of the central command table, catching the low ambient light of the chamber. Junior aide Serana watched the water tremble. Around her, the highest political and military minds of the 12 allied systems were breathing the relaxed air of a guaranteed triumph. The air itself smelled of sterile ozone and the synthetic citrus used in the atmospheric scrubbers. The Galactic Council had issued the final surrender demand to the human homeworld exactly 4 standard units ago. The terms were absolute: unconditional decommissioning of their orbital defense grid and full annexation of their outer colonies. In return, the Council would lift the economic sanctions that had slowly starved Earth of vital heavy metals. It was supposed to be a bloodless transition. 12 Council votes had been cast unanimously. A massive armada, pulling from 3 different star systems, sat in high orbit above the blue planet, casting shadows over its continents. Earth had no allies. They had no strategic leverage. The heavy pneumatic doors of the command chamber hissed open. Ashford walked in. He was listed on the diplomatic manifest as a civilian attaché, but his uniform bore no decorations, no colors of state. His steps were measured, quiet against the metallic floor grates, and his face held the rigid stillness of a frozen lake. Serana stood near the secondary biometric monitors at the edge of the room, tasked with observing the human's physiological stress responses. There were none. His resting heart rate was a steady 60 beats per minute. What happened in that room was buried by the provisional government for decades. If you think diplomacy is an exercise in peace, you will want to hear how this negotiation ends. Ashford took his seat at the far end of the long obsidian table. High Commander Kalen, his Alvari scales shimmering in a bright, triumphant silver, leaned heavily on his elbows. Kalen spoke of integration timelines, of provisional governors, of the generous mercy the Council was extending by allowing the human species to self-manage their agricultural sectors. Ashford let him speak. The human did not argue. He did not beg. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his dark jacket and withdrew a small, ornate wooden box. He placed it on the table. The wood was ancient, heavily scarred, and etched with fine metallic filigree. With a slow, deliberate motion, Ashford turned a small brass key on its side. A tiny mechanical click echoed across the vast room. Then the music box began to play. It was a fragile, crystalline melody, winding out across the polished table. The notes were asymmetrical, refusing to repeat in any predictable pattern. It plinked and chimed, a tiny, delicate sound totally out of place beneath the vaulted ceilings and tactical holograms of a military command center. Yet, it continued, looping its unmatchable sequence over and over, vibrating against the thick glass of the celebratory drinks. Kalen stopped speaking mid-sentence. The other council members exchanged irritated glances. Serana quickly checked the audio sensors. The sound was harmless, lacking any subharmonic frequencies or digital payloads. It was just a spinning metal drum plucking brass teeth. "Is this a cultural artifact of submission?" Kalen asked, his tone dripping with practiced condescension. Ashford adjusted his cuffs, his gaze fixed on the turning gears of the box. "Before we finalize the transition parameters, I have a logistical question. Will there be adjustments for dietary restrictions at the post-war dinner? Humans do not digest processed barium well." A few of the Allied generals chuckled at the absurdity. The arrogance in the room was thick enough to suffocate in. Serana looked back down at her telemetry screen, ignoring the laughter. She was running a routine diagnostic on the blockade's communication sweep. Her finger hovered over the glass display. 400 Allied warships held the orbital high ground, their weapon batteries fully charged, making a human defeat an absolute mathematical certainty. So why had Earth's planetary communication traffic suddenly plummeted to 0.02%? Populations under siege did not go quiet. They panicked. They flooded the network with farewell messages, emergency broadcasts, and frantic logistical chaos. A drop to near zero meant something else entirely. It meant a unified, planet-wide blackout. It meant absolute, terrifying discipline. Serana routed the anomaly to Commander Vale, the chief tactical officer sitting to Kalen's right. She watched Vale tap his earpiece. He frowned. He tapped it again, leaning forward into the light of the tactical display. The change in Vale was chemical and instantaneous. Alvari physiology reacted to extreme stress by withdrawing blood from the dermal layers. The bright, confident silver of his scales began to tarnish, shifting to a dull, sickly gray starting at the edges of his collar and spreading upward to his jawline. His posture collapsed inward. He did not speak. He did not issue a general alert. Instead, his hands trembled slightly as he unclasped the heavy gold rank insignia from his chest and placed it quietly on the console in front of him. He looked to his left. He looked to his right. He was waiting. The silence stretching between the notes of the music box was no longer a pause. It was an assessment. Ashford sat perfectly still, listening to the delicate, impossible melody. He checked his timepiece. The human fleet was supposed to be grounded, but the temperature in the command chamber felt distinctly colder, and the crystal glasses full of celebratory spirits sat entirely forgotten. Serana's biometric monitor finally registered a change. Ashford's heart rate had not spiked. It had dropped to 55 beats per minute. Commander Vale did not issue a general alert immediately. He stared at the anomaly on his screen, his dull gray skin stark against the pristine white of his uniform collar. The rest of the Galactic Council continued their muted celebrations, completely unaware that the architect of their destruction was sitting at the far end of their own table. Serana felt a cold knot tighten in her primary stomach. She watched Vale's fingers dance across the haptic interface, overriding the standard orbital protocols to run a deep-spectrum thermal sweep of the spatial sector just beyond Earth's moon. The command chamber's atmospheric scrubbers hummed softly, a steady drone beneath the erratic, plinking notes of the ancient wooden music box. The primary holographic display in the center of the table flickered. The peaceful blue sphere of the human homeworld dissolved into static. When the image resolved, the room fell dead silent. The space behind the moon was not empty. It was boiling with radiation. The human communication blackout had never been a surrender. It had been an acoustic shadow, a manufactured void designed entirely to mask the massive thermal bloom of a secondary fleet spooling up their experimental slipspace drives. Panic, sudden and violent, shattered the calm of the chamber. Admirals shouted over one another, demanding firing solutions. Serana's gaze fell back to the small wooden box. A junior data scribe at the adjacent station had panicked and routed the audio frequency of the melody through the Council's central decryption matrix, desperate to find a hidden virus. The scribe's hands shook so violently he could barely tap the glass. Serana read the output scrolling across his terminal. The mathematical complexity was staggering, which meant these prime number sequences should require billions of standard years to crack. Was this fragile little melody not just a song? It was a synchronous firing key. The massacre began before High Commander Kalen could even authorize an evacuation order. The hidden human armada did not emerge in standard combat formations. They dropped out of the void directly inside the Council fleet's orbital perimeter, completely bypassing the heavy forward magnetic shields of the Allied dreadnoughts. They materialized at point-blank range, moving with a velocity that defied established physics. They were already dead. Serana watched the telemetry feeds turn from green to blinding red. 400 Allied warships, the absolute pride of 12 star systems, were systematically dismantled in a matter of minutes. The human vessels did not waste energy on disabling shots or broadside barrages. They targeted command decks and reactor cores with terrifying surgical precision, ignoring everything else. The feed showed great silver hulls cracking open like fragile shells in the dark, spilling oxygen and debris into the cold vacuum. There were no heroic last stands. No grand tactical maneuvers. The Allied captains tried to pivot their heavy dreadnoughts, but the human strike craft were too fast, weaving through the lumbering giants and delivering localized payload detonations that shattered the structural spines of the alien vessels. Serana could only watch the casualty numbers ticking upward in thousands, a digital waterfall of lost lives scrolling across her secondary monitor. The sheer efficiency of the violence was paralyzing. It was not a battle born of desperation or rage. It was a cold, calculated extermination. Kalen slammed his fists onto the obsidian table. He demanded answers from his officers, screaming to know how the humans had bypassed their proximity alarms, how they had known exactly where the flagship blind spots were located. Ashford remained perfectly still. His pulse on Serana's monitor had never risen above 60. He was a man who had walked into a room of executioners knowing he was the only one holding a loaded weapon. He let the shouting echo off the high vaulted ceilings. Then he reached into his dark jacket a second time. He produced a thick stack of bound physical parchment paper. He slid it slowly across the polished table. It came to rest near Kalen's trembling hands. The condensation on the High Commander's crystal glass had pooled into a small, perfectly still puddle, a mundane anchor of reality amidst the sudden collapse of their entire empire. Kalen looked down at the parchment. It was the alien fleet's complete order of battle. Every single ship, every patrol route, every shield vulnerability, compiled by human intelligence and casually annotated with recommended response times in red ink. While the Council had spent the last 96 hours debating the philosophical merits of their generous surrender terms, the human military apparatus had quietly and systematically mapped every thermal exhaust port, every shift rotation, and every automated defense protocol in the Allied armada. Ashford stood up. He adjusted his collar, looking down at the pale, tarnished faces of the broken leaders. "Every empire thinks it is the exception," Ashford said, his voice entirely devoid of malice or triumph. "None of them are. I have studied war for 80 cycles," Serana recorded in the official archives, long after the provisional government had collapsed. "I have studied humanity for one day. I should have studied humanity first." The council dissolved into history, leaving behind only the recovered wooden music box. Its delicate, unmatchable melody sat silent in a glass vault, holding a mathematical impossibility that had unmade an empire.